camel hump, fish maw, deer sinew simmered with white fungus. When we picture what the emperors of China ate, we picture the impossible, the things you would have to send men into the mountains and down to the seabed to find. And all of that is real. But the food most tightly held inside the Forbidden City, the one thing an ordinary person was simply not permitted to eat, was rice. Plain white rice, grown on 2 small springs west of the capital. Because these rules were never really about what tasted good, they were about drawing a line. And a line drawn through rice is a line that touches everyone. The rice that fed the emperor was grown at only 2 places. Jade Spring Hill and Tang Spring sat in the Haidian district west of Beijing, and the grain that came from them was called Jingxi rice, meaning simply the rice grown west of the capital. The yield was low and the taste was excellent, which meant the supply was fixed. A fixed supply makes a rule enforceable, so by rule, only the emperor could eat it. Not because the grain was impossible to find elsewhere, but because the palace had decided these 2 springs produced the only rice worthy of the throne. That made the restriction both simple and absolute. A merchant with warehouses full of silver couldn't buy this rice. A governor with authority over a province couldn't eat it. The rule didn't bend for wealth, and it didn't bend for office. It bent only for the person who sat on the dragon throne, and even then, the rice had to come from those 2 springs, or it didn't count as his rice. That's how narrow the line was. In the early years of his reign, the Kangxi emperor kept a rice field at Fengzhe Garden inside the palace grounds. One season, he noticed a single ear that had ripened roughly 60 days ahead of everything around it. He had the seed collected. The next year, it ripened early again, and it tasted better than the rest. The grain was reddish, large, and fragrant, and because it came from that garden field, it was called Imperial rice. For more than 40 years afterward, it was reserved for the emperor's own meals. Even the water to cook it was carried in each morning from Jade Spring Hill, which Qianlong later honored with an inscription naming it the foremost spring under heaven. If the line could be drawn through the most ordinary food in China, then the line itself was the point. Rarity was incidental. Legibility was the product. If a bowl of rice can be forbidden, you can imagine what else was. So do stay with me and subscribe. This is where we sit with how power in Asia truly worked, slowly, the way it deserves. And the rice was only the beginning, because the rules didn't only say what you could eat, they said whose fire it could come from. The imperial kitchen and the imperial bakery served only the emperor and the royal family. No one else could eat from their fires. This wasn't a custom or a preference. It was an institutional boundary enforced by the Office of Palatial Affairs, and crossing it was among the gravest offences in the code. The imperial buttery sat under the imperial household department and handled the ordinary meals of the court. It was a centralized system, streamlined and regulated, with access tightly controlled so that only a trusted few could enter. The cooks were masters of specialized categories, and many spent their entire lives perfecting one or several dishes. If a cook wished to create something new, he assumed a risk. If the emperor liked the dish, his bonus would be impressive. If the emperor disliked it, the cook would be punished or demoted. The palace didn't reward creativity, it rewarded consistency. That meant control of the kitchen was control of the rule itself. You didn't need to inspect every table in the empire if you controlled the only fires that could legally prepare an imperial meal. The restriction ran in both directions. The emperor couldn't eat from anyone else's kitchen either, and the same rules that fenced everyone out of his food also fenced him inside it. The imperial kitchen we covered in the previous video served the inner circle alone, and that fence was legal as well as physical. Now here is where the table stops being about food at all and starts being about who had conquered whom. The Manchu rulers who founded the Qing Dynasty came from the north, and they brought their own foods to the center of the court. Fermented milk curds, cream cakes, and salted milk tea weren't exotic luxuries to them. They were the tastes of home, and their presence at the emperor's table was a daily reminder that a conquering minority was running the empire. The preparation was specific. Tea bricks were broken into boiling water, then milk and butter and a pinch of salt were added, and the leaves were filtered out before the mixture was served from a silver pot. A surviving teapot decorated with gilded dragons sits in the Hong Kong Palace Museum, where the curator has described the exact method. The object grounds the custom in something you can picture. To Han Chinese officials, these dairy foods were unfamiliar. Fermented milk curds and cream cakes puzzled them, and the confusion turns up in Qing-era literature. The cultural divide wasn't hidden. It was served at every meal, and the Manchu minority kept its own foods at the center of power precisely because they were different. The food wasn't incidental to the rule. It was the rule, made edible. Which brings us to the picture almost everyone has of the imperial table and to how little of it survives contact with the records. If you've ever seen the imperial table on film, you've seen the Great Manchu and Han banquet, 100 dishes running the length of a room, 3 days of feasting. It's the picture everyone carries. And modern versions of that feast are far more standardized and far grander than anything the records actually support. The daily reality was a court that ate by protocol, where the most powerful man in the empire had almost no say in what arrived in front of him. We know this because the archives survived. One scholar spent close to 40 years inside them at the old palace's West Prosperity Gate, working through centuries of documents that recorded what was eaten, when, in which hall, and by whose hand it was cooked. He believes the records were closed to researchers sometime in the 1990s, which means much of what we know comes from that single window of access. The precision is difficult to believe. On the 30th day of the 9th month in the 12th year of Qianlong's reign, His Majesty took his breakfast at about 7 in the morning in the Hall of Grand Virtue. On the first day of the 10th month, at about 2 in the afternoon, he took his late meal in the eastern heated room of the Hall of Double Glory. On that same day, he asked for a dinner of 15 courses with wine, wild game, and fowl served on red porcelain in the Hall of Mental Cultivation. 3 different rooms in 2 days, and every detail was written down. It looked like limitless appetite. It was a rule book with a menu attached. Let me ask you something. Every single food on this list can be bought today by anyone with the money for it. Does that feel like freedom to you, or simply a different kind of line? Tell me below. I read every answer. So how does one household eat like this? The answer runs through every province in the empire. Provincial officials across the country graded and forwarded food for a single household in Beijing, and the system's real output wasn't dinner. It was a standing demonstration that the provinces answered to the center. Tribute tea began as a formal practice in the Jin period and continued for centuries. Tea-growing regions were required to present their finest leaves to the court, and the obligation was written into tax law. In the Qing Dynasty, tea smuggling was treated as among the gravest offences in the code, which shows how seriously the state guarded its monopoly. The Ming bureaucracy later managed tea taxes, tribute deliveries, and price setting, turning what began as a ritual gift into a coercive economic institution. Tribute white grain came from 5 southeastern prefectures: Suzhou, Songjiang, Changzhou, Jiaqing, and Huzhou were each required to deliver thousands of bushels of rice and glutinous rice to the capital. In the early Ming, roughly 170,000 bushels were collected. Under the Qing, the official requirement rose to about 220,000 bushels shipped to Beijing along the Grand Canal. An additional surcharge covered transport losses, and when grain was converted to silver, the rate could run up to 5 times the market price. The cost of feeding the elite fell heavily on the farmers who grew the rice. The tribute list ran the length of the empire. Peanuts and dates arrived from Shandong. Dried persimmons came from Henan. Hami melons traveled from Shanxi and Gansu. Lychees, longan, and tangerines came up from Guangdong and Fujian. Grapes, hazelnuts, and hawthorn berries moved south from northeast China. The emperor's table was a map of the realm, and every delivery was a reminder of who ruled whom. Ask a simpler question, not what you were served. Who was permitted to cook it for you? The answer depended entirely on your rank, and in the Qing palace, rank was measured in cooks. The empress dowager, and the consorts each maintained separate kitchens with separate staff. A crown prince received a kitchen only upon marriage, which meant that until his wedding, he didn't have his own fires. The meal portioning system allocated ingredients by rank with exact quantities written down, and the emperor naturally received the largest share. His daily allowance included 22 catties of meat, which is roughly 30 pounds, along with 5 catties of soup meat, 2 sheep, 5 chickens, and 3 ducks. Much of this was displayed for show rather than eaten, and what the emperor left uneaten was distributed downward to concubines, princes, and high officials. Their leftovers went to lower concubines and eunuchs. The hierarchy was carved into every stage of the meal. Concubines weren't permitted to choose their own food. Their meals were decided in the imperial kitchen and delivered to their quarters by palace maids. And before they ate, a eunuch tested the dishes for poison using silverware. If a concubine fell out of favor, her meals were downgraded to plain rice and vegetables, a visible sign that her status had collapsed. If she became pregnant with a prince, her diet was upgraded overnight with nourishing dishes, because giving birth to an heir could change her position completely. The food didn't follow the body, it followed the rank, and the rank could shift without warning. And then there were the dishes that existed for one reason only, to prove how far the empire could reach. Camel hump, fish maw, deer sinew simmered with white fungus. These were the foods that people picture when they imagine the imperial table, and they were real, but their purpose wasn't taste, it was distance. A dish made from ingredients gathered across the empire was a map of the realm, and serving it proved that the court could command resources from thousands of miles away. The Manchu sacrificial rites were fixed by the Qing palace as national rites, and the meat from these ceremonies became part of the imperial diet. White meat, simply boiled premium pork from the sacrificial rites, was dipped in sauces and served as a reminder of ancestral tradition. Wrapped meals originated from Nurhachi's battlefield improvisations, when cabbage leaves were smeared with sauce and filled with mixed rice and diced meats. These were practical foods that became ceremonial over time, and their presence at court connected the ruling family to its martial origins. The famous Manchu and Han Imperial feast that appears in modern films and restaurants is far more standardized and grand than the historical records support. Modern recreations claim hundreds of dishes served over multiple days, but the archives describe a court that ate by protocol, not by spectacle. The rare ingredients were real, and the effort to obtain them was real, but they were statements of power more than they were meals. The empire stretched from the mountains to the sea, and the banquet table was where that stretch was measured. But the clearest signal at the imperial table wasn't a dish at all. It was what you carried to the door. When officials requested an audience at the emperor's mealtime, they submitted plates whose color announced their rank before they spoke a single word. Red plates were used by princes and members of the royal family. Green plates were carried by civil officials above the rank of deputy chief of the court of censors and by military officers above the rank of provincial military governor. Common plates were for officials from outside the capital above the rank of chief prosecutor of the provincial high court and for military officers above the rank of area commander. The memorials office collected these plates and presented them to the emperor, who decided which memorials would be heard and which officials would be called in. Because the plates were submitted at mealtime, they were known as meal plates, and they turned the dining hour into a public announcement of the hierarchy. Rank was visible before a word was spoken. The emperor was fenced in by the same system, tested and tasted for before every meal, as we saw in the last video. These were never 7 foods. They were 7 places where the line between one rank and the next was drawn in something you could eat. Graded kitchens, a grain grown on one hillside, plates carried to a door in the right color. None of it existed because the food was good. It existed because an empire needed to know at every table, twice a day, exactly who was who. The dishes were the filing system, and the strangest part is the man at the center of it, because the same rules that kept everyone else out of his kitchen kept him inside it. He couldn't eat from anyone else's fire either. Today, every single food on this list can be bought by anyone who can pay for it, and nothing at all is forbidden. And yet we still read a person's place from what is set in front of them. The line didn't disappear, it simply stopped being written down. If this was worth your time, then subscribe and stay a while. There are more of these hidden rules of the table still to come, and the next one is already being prepared. And if you want to know why Japan banned meat for 1,200 years and what they ate instead, watch this video next.